Okay, so here is part 3 of lecture number 2. This is going to transition us from chapter 7 into chapter 8 in America Past and Present. We're going to be dealing with the election of 1800 and the administration of Thomas Jefferson. So John Adams has completed his first term as President of the United States. It's seen the U.S. fail to avoid a war with France because of the XYZ affair. That's led to the quasi-war, which led to the Alien Sedition Acts and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were the Democratic-Republican response to those laws. It has seen Thomas Jefferson insert the concepts of nullification and secession into the national conversation, and all of that, therefore, is the context for the election of 1800. Adams was, of course, working with the misfortune of living in the shadow of George Washington. There's no way anybody who replaced George Washington could actually compare with the father of the country, and so he was a vulnerable incumbent, and the Federalist Party recognized that, and it also, of course, by this point recognized that the vice presidency really wasn't a very important job, and so the Federalists, instead of trying to maintain both the presidency and the vice presidency in 1800, decided to emphasize holding on to the presidency, and they nominated a single candidate, and that candidate was the sitting president, John Adams. The Democratic Republicans, sensing the electoral winds blowing in their favor, decided to go for everything, and they nominated two candidates, Thomas Jefferson, of course, the leader of their party, but also Aaron Burr of New York. So this ticket splitting again, Southerner and a Northerner to balance the ticket. And when the election was held, Jefferson and Burr managed to get the most of the popular votes, but remember, popular votes really don't matter. We still have a system whereby the man who gets the most electoral votes becomes president, the man who gets the second most becomes vice president, and when the election was held in the Electoral College, Alexander Hamilton, who once again was not one of the candidates, one more time tried to manipulate the system to lock Adams into the vice presidency, and that backfired, simply confused everything, with the result that when the votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr had tied. In other words, there was a tie, and the constitutional system recognized that a tie was a possibility, and so they set up a method by which, if there is no clear winner in the Electoral College, the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. And here, Burr decided to get ambitious, and he tried to steal the presidency from Jefferson. It didn't work, in part thanks to Hamilton going to Federalist electors who were supporting Burr in an effort to keep Jefferson from becoming president and leaving him stuck as vice president. Hamilton said, come on, if the shoe was on the other foot, we would hate the rival party doing this to us. And ultimately, after 36 ballots, Jefferson prevailed. So Jefferson is going to become the third president of the United States. Aaron Burr is going to become the third vice president of the United States. And you finally have a president and vice president from the same party. They're both Democratic Republicans. But of course, how well do you think they're going to get along? Jefferson is not happy with Burr, who tried to pull the rug out from under his feet. And so the vice president is still going to wind up being a very unimportant office. That said, everybody by this point recognizes that this business of the vice presidency being the consolation prize for the runner-up in the electoral vote really isn't working the way that the Founding Fathers had envisioned. So we get an amendment to the Constitution, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which was finally ratified in 1804 by the necessary number of states, set up the system that we have today, where president and vice president are running mates. You either run for the presidency or you run for the vice presidency. And the vice presidency, therefore, doesn't become the consolation prize. It's not the prize for the runner-up. The Democratic Republicans, of course, also captured control of the Congress, and so they sweep into power, and the Federalists are swept out of power. And this is where the election of 1800 becomes arguably the most important election in American history, because remember how much the two political parties feared each other. The Democratic Republicans were convinced that the Federalists would do anything to stay in power, to manipulate the government in their own selfish interest, that they would create a police state if that's what was necessary to hold on to power. And the Federalists were convinced that the Democratic Republicans were a little bit better than a mob, that they were revolutionaries in the worst sense of the word at heart, that they would stage violent revolution in order to get control of the government. Both of them feared the other guy would not uphold the Constitution, would destroy democracy, would bring down the whole republic, and those fears had gotten worse over time. They hadn't alleviated over time, and nonetheless, in 1800, the people voted and told the Federalists, you have to leave power. And they told the the Democratic Republicans, you get to take power. And what perhaps surprised a lot of people is that the Federalists, despite all these dour predictions about police state and arresting their opposition and whatnot, actually accepted the will of the people, folded their tents, moaning, groaning, and complaining, mind you, left the government, turned the keys over to the Democratic Republicans who took power. And so the position of the two parties flipped. The Federalists had always been in power, now they're out of power. The Democratic Republicans had always been out of power, now they're in power. And with the two sides now standing where the opposition had been all this time, there was a dawning realization of where the other guy had been coming from. The Federalist understood that when you're out of power, the only thing that you can do to influence events is to critique the people who are in power, and that critiquing people in power is not treason, it's not rebellion, it's not planting the seeds of revolution. It is, in fact, a little bit liberating because you get to make all the criticisms, but you have no responsibility for making things better or doing things better. And so you don't have to prove that your criticisms are valid. You don't have to prove that you could do better as long as you're out of power. And that this is the way that the Democratic Republicans have been acting all along. For the Democratic Republicans, of course, they're now in charge, and they find out that being in charge is hard, that it's not as easy as they had imagined that it might be, that governing is not making a choice between the right thing and the wrong thing, the good thing and the evil thing, the obvious thing and the non-obvious thing, if you will. It's making decisions in dilemmas. It's choosing the least bad of a bunch of bad scenarios, or doing the least difficult in the midst of a bunch of difficult things. And so where you stand is where you sit. And the two parties came to understand that. I mean, think about it this way. If you have ever been dumped in your lifetime, somebody that you had a relationship with and cared deeply about and shared a lot with suddenly decides to end the relationship, it's a devastating thing, isn't it? You begin to question, was any of it real? Were those feelings true? And how could this person hurt you like this? And just walk away, and you imagine they go off and they're living a happy, wonderful life, and you're sitting there wallowing in misery. And then later on, perhaps you're the person who winds up dumping someone, and you realize at that point that dumping someone is as painful and as hard as being dumped. And that the dumper doesn't go off to happiness any more than the dumpee goes off to happiness. But until you've been both dumped and the one being dumped, or doing the dumping, you don't see that. And so the same thing here with the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And thus is born out of the election of 1800 one of the most vital concepts in all of American history and all American political science, and that is the concept of the loyal opposition. Criticism is not treason. The parties know that both sides are going to play by the rules. They're going to adhere to the Constitution. They're going to abide by the will of the voters. They are going to keep to the schedule of elections that are held in the Constitution. And even if they think the other guy is completely wrong, that he's going to destroy the public and subvert the Constitution, they're going to play by those rules. And you don't have to plot rebellion or revolution or coup because every 2 years, you get a chance to control the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. And every 4 years, you get a chance at not only controlling the House of Representatives and a new third of the Senate, but also the presidency of the United States. And it's a lot easier then to raise money, to craft campaigns, to select candidates, to try and convince the voters to put you in office instead of the other guy than it is to stockpile arms and munitions and to make bombs and to prepare to roll the dice on a violent revolutionary overthrow of the government. And so the election of 1800 is incredibly important, and it brings Thomas Jefferson into office. And Jefferson actually came in with an agenda, which was a little bit unusual this early in American history. He wanted to reduce the size and cost of the federal government, which is, of course, a perpetual goal of campaigns for the presidency. And here we are at a time when the size and cost of the federal government would be dwarfed by the size and cost of the administration of Austin Community College, and yet people are already saying it's too big and it costs too much. And Jefferson, of course, is going to reduce the cost of the government in a traditional way in the 19th century. He's going to shrink the Army, and he's in fact going to mothball the entire Navy because cutting the military was always a way to save money. And with the United States shielded, at least as Americans thought, by the Atlantic Ocean, then why not? Do you really need to have a lot of peacetime military power around? Jefferson's going to find out that you do, but in the beginning, this is his cost saving. Of course, he wants to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's easily done because his party is now in power, and he wants to keep the peace. He believes in diplomacy as a way of solving international disputes. He wants to stay away from the war that's raging in Europe, just like Washington had wanted to stay away from it and Adams had wanted to stay away from it, so there was some continuity there. Jefferson actually worked well with Congress. He never vetoed a single act that came out of the Congress. He did make a concession to the military. If we're going to shrink the size and rely on the militia to defend the country, Jefferson at least recognized the militia had to be well led. And so he went along with Congress to create the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1802. Jefferson, of course, is going to have to deal with a lot of problems as president, just like Washington and Adams did. And one of his first problems came very early on, and it's going to be a monumental moment in the evolution of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court had been envisioned by the Constitution. It had been created under the dictates of the Constitution during Washington's first administration. But the Supreme Court, until the administration of Thomas Jefferson, had not really had much power. In fact, it had had virtually no power. It seemed like just a normal district or circuit court. That changes as Jefferson becomes president, because one of the things that's true about the way that we change our leaders at the top is that the outgoing president is president with all the powers, rights, and prerogatives of that office until the moment his replacement finishes the oath of office. And that meant that John Adams had all the powers of the presidency until he didn't. And as he was going out in the months between the election and Jefferson's inauguration, which would be in March of 1801, we didn't start inaugurating presidents in January until the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, Adams is busy appointing good Federalists to judicial positions. If the Democratic Republicans are going to get the Congress and they're going to get the presidency, then the Federalists can at least try and hold on to the courts. And it was perfectly valid and legal for Adams to do this. But when Jefferson comes into office and he makes James Madison his Secretary of State, and they start going through the papers of the Adams administration, they realize that in these last few months, Adams has made all these judicial appointments, and infuriated Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. They thought this was grossly unfair. We won the election. We should get to fill those jobs. And of course, the reality is no, not necessarily. That's not the way the game works. That's not the way the Constitution reads. And therefore, there wasn't much that the Jefferson administration could do about it, except these judicial appointments did not become valid until a letter of commission was delivered to the appointee. And it turns out that not all those letters of commission had been delivered. And specifically, one had not been delivered to a good Federalist by the name of William Marbury, who was being appointed Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia. A relatively minor position, to be sure, but it came with a paycheck and Mabry wanted it. But now that Jefferson is in charge, he directs his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to send out any undelivered letters of commission. In other words, Mr. Marbury is not going to get his Justice of the Peace job. And Marbury didn't like that, and so he sued the government under one of the recently passed Judiciary Acts, and the case went automatically to the Supreme Court, because at that point the Supreme Court was really the only court that existed in the new Capitol, which was being built out of a swamp on the north bank of the Potomac. It would be called Washington in the District of Columbia. So that's the only court. So it immediately hears that case. And Jefferson was like, oh, well, that's great. We're going to lose because John Marshall is the Chief Justice, and along with the other justices, he's a Federalist, and they're going to side with Marbury, who's a Federalist. And therefore, you can imagine his surprise when that's not what happened. In fact, Marshall's Supreme Court threw out Marbury's case, refused to give him the job, on the basis that the law under which he was suing, the Judiciary Act, was unconstitutional. And initially, of course, Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans were like, yay, we won, we don't have to give out the job. And then everybody realized, wait, did you see what just happened? What just happened is that for the first time, the Supreme Court of the United States has declared a law passed by Congress and signed by a president to be unconstitutional. And in doing so and getting away with it, the Supreme Court grabbed for itself a power that the Founding Fathers had in fact intended it to have, and that is the power of judicial review. The power of judicial review. That is the right to determine the constitutionality of federal law. And so that case, Marbury versus Madison, because Madison as Secretary of State is the person that would have had to turn over the letter of commission, Marbury versus Madison gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review over federal law, and therefore the power of the Supreme Court comes into being as we understand it today. And a few years later, in another case, Fletcher versus Peck, which is a complicated case dealing with land ownership in the southern colonies, the Supreme Court obtains the right of judicial review over state law. So part of Jefferson becoming president is the fact that the Supreme Court sort of comes into its own as the third branch of the federal government, getting the power of judicial review over federal law in Marbury versus Madison, and the power of judicial review over state law in the case of Fletcher versus Peck. So that is part of Jefferson's ascension to the presidency of the United States. There are other issues that Jefferson has to deal with, and one of those is foreign policy. So he's retired most of the Navy. He's relying on small coastal ships to simply defend America's coastline and its ports. And that means that American commerce on the high seas is vulnerable to privateers and pirates. And this was especially true in the Mediterranean Sea, where the Muslim nations that inhabited the northern coast of North Africa, known as the Barbary states, preyed on merchant shipping, taking ships captive, of course, taking all their cargo, enslaving their crews and selling them as slaves or holding them for ransom and that sort of thing. And since there was no U.S. Navy, America's merchant ships plying the waters of the Mediterranean were exceptionally vulnerable to the Barbary pirates, and they were attacking our ships and seizing their crews with great frequency. This was a problem that Jefferson had to deal with. And of course, there were some people who were demanding more, but Jefferson is kind of a pacifist. He believes that reason and logic should dictate the resolution of problems, and that reasonable, logical men run governments, run countries, and that sort of thing. And so he's reluctant to use military action. He tries diplomacy. And what the Barbary pirates tell him is, hey, we're more than happy to leave your ships alone if you'll pay us a tribute of $100,000. And a lot of people, of course, were offended by that. The countries of Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis making these kinds of demands on the United States. But Jefferson reasoned that, hey, $100,000 is a lot cheaper in terms of both money and certainly in terms of lives than a war. And so he got Congress to pay it. Now, at the same time, suspecting that maybe this wouldn't work out right, he also authorized or got Congress to authorize the building of warships. He's going to abandon his program of getting rid of the Navy, and he's going to begin to expand the Navy. And it's just as well that he did, because the Barbary states sort of ran through that first tribute payment, and then they started attacking our ships again, at which point Jefferson said, hey, I thought we had a deal. And they said, well, we do if you'll pay us more money. And for Jefferson, even that was a bridge too far. And so he begins to send American military vessels into the Caribbean. In response, Tripoli declares war on the United States in May of 1801, and the U.S. gets its second foreign war, the so-called Tripoli War, which is small in terms of numbers and ships, but a very dramatic affair. If you've ever heard the Marine Corps hymn, and it talks about from the halls of Montezuma, which is a reference to the Mexican War in the 1840s, to the shores of Tripoli, well, there's a reference to the Tripoli War, which the United States finally won. The United States Navy and Marine Corps managed to triumph by June of 1805, and America, ended the threat of the Barbary pirates by resurrecting its naval power. And having resurrected it, we are not going to get rid of it again in the future. And of course, this all accrues to Jefferson's benefit here. He's fought a war and he's won a war. And Americans like our presidents to win the wars that they decide to fight. And so Jefferson is off to a really good start, but it's going to get even better for him than that. And this is going to happen because of something called the Louisiana Purchase. So remember that at the end of the French and Indian War, the French had transferred all of their territory west of the Mississippi to Spain so that they wouldn't have to surrender it to the British in the Peace of Paris. And the idea had been that the Spanish will hold on to it for a while and then they'll give it back to France. Well, the Spanish, in fact, never got around to giving it back to France. That is not until Napoleon Bonaparte managed to conquer Spain. And once he conquered Spain and installed a friendly head to the Spanish government, the Spanish transferred Louisiana territory back to France in 1801. And so all of a sudden, the French control the west bank of the Mississippi River. They also control the city of New Orleans. And remember, Spain controls Florida Peninsula and the Gulf Coast of North America. And this business of New Orleans was a big deal because the United States has been growing west. You have Kentucky and Tennessee that are states now. You've got territories in Ohio and Indiana, and all that commerce going down the Mississippi down the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, which goes out into the world's markets via New Orleans. And the idea that there was suddenly a foreign power in control of the mouth of the Mississippi was very, very troubling. It became even more troubling when a large French army comes to the Western Hemisphere. And this army was sent to the Caribbean, to the island of Santo Domingo, which was a French sugar colony where there had been a very serious slave insurrection. It was a very bloody and ugly kind of an affair, and the slaves were attempting to, not only win their freedom, but to conquer the whole island. Napoleon sent an army there to deal with it. The French managed to hold on to half the island, which is still known as Santo Domingo today. The other half of the island was the part conquered by the slaves, and it's known as Haiti today. And there's a big mountain that cuts across the island that separates these two countries. But the effort of the French came at a huge cost because the big army that they sent there, which numbered in the tens of thousands of men, lost a large percentage of its troops to disease. And for Napoleon, that was a waste. And he also understood that although he had initially ambitions about making hay out of reacquiring Louisiana Purchase, the British Navy was going to keep him from doing that. He'd lost a lot of good troops to disease on Santo Domingo. Those are troops that he could have certainly used on the battlefields of Europe. And if he continued to try and hold on to Louisiana Purchase, eventually the British were going to wrest it away from him. And so he decided that maybe the time had come to get rid of it. And he told his foreign policy staff, quote, "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies, I renounce Louisiana." He wanted to find a way out. And the timing for Jefferson's administration could not have been better because he had decided to send American negotiators to Paris to see if the French would be willing to sell the city of New Orleans so that we controlled the entrance and the exit to the Mississippi River. And the American negotiators got to Paris and they asked the French, would you be willing to sell the United States the city of New Orleans? And the French, who had just been told by Napoleon, let's get rid of Louisiana, asked the Americans, well, would you like to buy all of the Louisiana territory? And the Americans looked at each other. This is not what they'd been authorized to do. And they said, well, how much? And the French said, how about $15 million? And the Americans sort of put pen to paper and very quickly said, you've got a deal. And they transmitted word of this to Jefferson, who automatically agreed to make the purchase, which is not a very strict constructionalist thing to do, right? Because if you believe in a strict construction, a strict, narrow interpretation of the Constitution, only the House of Representatives can start the business of spending money. Presidents aren't supposed to be able to spend money that is not authorized by the House, and yet Jefferson did this, and he felt a little sheepish about it, but he need not have worried because as soon as Congress came back into session, Congress was more than happy to approve what Jefferson had done, to approve this purchase of Louisiana territory. And little wonder, because not only did this open the Mississippi River up to American control, it doubled the size of the country. So the Louisiana Purchase leaps the U.S. over the Mississippi. Now there's no real obstacle between it and the Pacific except the Rocky Mountains. We gain 830,000 square miles of territory. That adds up to 53 billion square miles, or I'm sorry, 53 billion acres, and that's billion with a B. And if you do the math, 15 million into 53 billion means that we bought all of that territory for less than 3 cents an acre. Jefferson, of course, was very proud of this. He sends an expedition under Lewis and Clark all the way across the territory to see if the Missouri River dumps into the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the great epics of exploration and discovery in American history. Of course, the Missouri doesn't empty into the Pacific. The Rocky Mountains are in the way, but Lewis and Clark still get into, the northwest corner of the continent, and they come back to tell wonders about the topography and the natives who live there and the animals and all this kinds of thing. And naturally, this doubling the size of the country made Jefferson extremely popular. In fact, Jefferson believed he had now acquired so much land for the United States that it would take the American people until the 1970s to occupy all of it. Jefferson was wrong about that, and we're going to find out how wrong he was. But nonetheless, this is the sort of thing, winning wars and doubling the size of the country, that is going to get you reelected. And in fact, Jefferson was a shoo-in in the election of 1804, and he easily won reelection. Everything for Mr. Jefferson was going just about as well as you could imagine it going. And of course, that in and of itself is a harbinger of bad things to come, because when everything is going great, you can pretty much imagine that sooner or later it will be going less great. What goes up must come down. Fortunately, what comes down eventually bounces back up, but that was one of the realities that Jefferson was going to face, that the gravity was going to bring his administration down. He's going to go from being one of the most popular men in the country in 1804 to being one of the most hated men in the country when he leaves office in 1808. So Jefferson is reelected in 1804, and of course one of the things that's not going to happen in 1804 is that Aaron Burr is not going to be Jefferson's running mate. After trying to snatch the presidency out of Jefferson's hand when the election of 1800 went to the House of Representatives, Burr is persona non grata. He's not on the ticket, and that's very disappointing to Burr, who still had great political ambitions. And so while he's still the sitting vice president, he decides to run for the governorship of New York. And here he runs into political opposition, and one of his political opponents is Alexander Hamilton, who's not trying to run for the office himself, but thinks that Burr is the wrong guy for the job. And of course, Hamilton's a Federalist, Burr's a Democratic Republican, so clearly Hamilton doesn't want Burr to get the job. And Hamilton, told some friends at a dinner party one night that Burr was a dangerous man who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government. Word of that got back to Burr. Hamilton and Burr had actually served in the Continental Army together during the Revolutionary War. It wasn't like they hated each other or anything like that, but they were gentlemen in the upper crust of society, and therefore honor was all important to them. And when Burr lost the election, he blamed, in part, Hamilton, and he resented Hamilton's attack on his reputation, and he demanded an apology. And Hamilton made all sorts of friendly overtures, but would not rescind his comment. And letters went back and forth between the two of them for quite some time, and both men actually trying to find a way to patch it up, but to maintain their honor. And for Burr, the only way to maintain his honor was to have Hamilton retract, and for Hamilton, he could do anything but retract and maintain his honor. So ultimately, this thing boils down to an irreconcilable situation, and therefore Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel, in what will turn out to be the most famous duel in American history. Now, dueling was an ancient tradition. It had been brought to America from the British colonies. It was still rather common and acceptable in the South, but in the Middle and New England states, it had been dying out for a long time. In fact, a lot of states have laws against dueling, although sometimes the government and the law looked the other way, depending on circumstances. Hamilton himself didn't believe in dueling. He thought dueling was foolish, and particularly because his own son had been killed in a duel 3 years earlier. But it was an affair of honor. That's what duels were. It was an affair of honor. And how could Hamilton refuse to face the dueling pistol if his own son had been willing to face it? And how could he maintain his reputation if it appeared as he was too cowardly to face the dueling field? So he agreed. And the two men met on a field in Weehawken, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from New York City on July 11th of 1804. And it was a bad choice of a site because it was the same field where Hamilton's son had died 3 years earlier. And when the duel was fought, Burr had mortally wounded Hamilton. There's some question as to whether or not Burr actually meant to do that, but it's what happened. Hamilton was rowed back across the river. He was taken home. He died 3 days later, and thus he exits our story. He exits our story. He never becomes president. His importance in American history, though, is unquestionable and is represented by the fact that he's only one of two men who's on our paper money who was never president. The other is Benjamin Franklin, who's on the $100 bill. Hamilton, as the first Secretary of Treasury, is on the $10 bill. And so Hamilton is gone. Burr is still alive, but now Burr's in big trouble. If the popular Hamilton had killed the unpopular Burr, the law probably looks the other way. But what happened was the unpopular Burr had killed a very popular Hamilton, and therefore the state of New York, where Hamilton and Burr both lived, and the state of New Jersey, where the duel had been fought, both indicted Burr for murder because technically dueling was illegal in those two states. And so the sitting vice president of the United States is now under indictment for murder in 2 of the 15 states in the Union. And as bad as some of our politicians have gotten themselves into the trouble over the decades, it's been a long time since we've had a sitting vice president indicted for murder in 2 states. And so that's really the finish of Burr's political career, and that seems to have sent him around the bend and not just politically, but in terms of sanity. And he began to orchestrate this very bizarre plot to build a private army and then borrow the resources of the U.S. Army occupying newly purchased New Orleans and use it to invade the Spanish Southwest, meaning Texas and western Louisiana, and build an empire for himself to govern. It was all very strange and very complex, and eventually he's found out, he's arrested, and he's tried for treason. And that trial takes place in front of John Marshall's Supreme Court because, again, it's the only court of note in the District of Columbia. And Burr was extremely unpopular. The public wanted him convicted and hung. The press wanted him convicted and hung. The Jefferson administration wanted him convicted and hung. And yet that's not what happened, because Marshall's Supreme Court took another step in codifying the importance of that institution to the Constitution and to the American Republic. He ignored all of that pressure and adhered to the letter of the law. And the Constitution has a very strict definition of treason. And of course it does, because the Founding Fathers were aware that one of the favorite instruments of tyrants, of kings, monarchs, was to have their political opposition arrested, tried, and executed for treason. And that usually could happen on very slim evidence or the testimony of a single person, which of course was easy to orchestrate or manipulate. And so the Founding Fathers had actually put a definition of treason into the U.S. Constitution. You have to be giving aid, direct aid, to an enemy of the United States in time of war for it to be treason. And there must be two eyewitnesses to every overt act of treason, which of course is a very high bar to reach. And in the dramatic and convoluted trial of Aaron Burr, the government could not produce those eyewitnesses. And a lot of things that Burr had done were suspicious, and a lot of them were harebrained, but none of them ever actually met the definition of treason. And so Burr was acquitted. And that infuriated Jefferson, it infuriated the press, it infuriated much of the public. But it was an important victory for the Constitution, because the Constitution says people have rights. And it's all the people. It's the good people and the bad people, the popular people and the unpopular people. And if the unpopular and the disliked can be denied their rights because they're unpopular and they're disliked, then nobody has any rights. Today you might be popular, tomorrow you might not be. Today you might be liked, tomorrow you might not be. In other words, the law could favor you one day and not favor you the other. And that's not the kind of system the Founding Fathers intended to set up. That's not the kind of system they wrote into the Constitution, and Marshall adheres to that. And so this is a great victory for the concept of equal justice for all Americans, even if it was quite a shock to everyone's system at the time. And so Jefferson's administration is one where consequential, monumental things happen. It's during his term that the slave trade is finally abolished. In 1808, the moment that the Constitution made that possible, it is done. So Jefferson's administration, this first term, the beginning of his second term, very monumental things, but ultimately Jefferson is going to get tripped up by the war in Europe. So what's happening there? What's happening there is Napoleon Bonaparte's army has been conquering most of Europe, while the British Navy is tightening its blockade of France and territory that France controls. And on October 21st of 1805, in one of the great naval battles in history, the Battle of Trafalgar, the British Navy, under the command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, defeats the combined navies of France and Spain. And by defeating them, basically takes control of the waters around Europe, codifies its blockade. The French Navy is reduced to little more than a raiding force relying upon privateers. Not long afterwards, on December 2nd of 1805, the French army under Napoleon defeats the combined armies of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz, and knocks those two countries out of the war. And after the Battle of Austerlitz, there's only one nation that has not given up its fight against Napoleon, and that is England. All of the other countries in Europe have either been conquered by Napoleon or beaten into neutrality. They're going to lick their wounds and recover and jump back into the fight, but it's going to take a while. So you have, by the dawn of 1806, a set of circumstances where France controls the continent of Europe and England controls the waters around the continent of Europe. And there's no real way for these two countries to really grapple with each other. Unless the French army learns to walk on water, it's not going to fight the British Navy. And unless the British Navy sprouts wheels and rolls up on land, it's not going to fight the French army. They can skirmish with each other around the periphery, and of course they do, but in terms of doing real damage to one another, it becomes very hard. And of course, neither side is willing to make peace because this is a death grapple between England and France. The British actually say Napoleon's the Antichrist. He's got to be brought down. And Napoleon, of course, is determined, as are the French people, to preserve their revolution. And so there is stalemate. And in the midst of that stalemate, then there is going to be economic warfare. There's going to be economic warfare, and this economic warfare is going to cause the United States a great deal of trouble. So what happens is first off, the British issue something called the Orders of Council in 1806. And those Orders of Council basically forbid all neutral commerce with Europe. The British Navy is going to keep any ship that is not an English ship from trading with Europe. And the British are going to make sure that what gets to Europe is going to its former allies who it's trying to rebuild so they can jump back into the war against Napoleon. But for the Americans, of course, this was a grievous economic blow, and we thought an unjust one, because remember what our definition of neutral rights are. We get to ignore wars and blockades. As long as we're not carrying arms and munitions, our ships should be able to come and go. And now the British are saying, no, that's not going to happen. And they're going to interfere with American commerce and keep us from trading with France, with French colonies, or any territory that the French control. Now, of course, the British do not have anything like the number of ships to completely cut off that trade. And Jefferson argues that makes the English blockade technically illegal, but technically doesn't matter. Power in the real world is what matters, and the English had it. There was another problem, of course, with England, and that was the fact that the British had to vastly expand their fleet as well as their army to fight Napoleon. And Britain, being an island nation, did not begin to have the manpower that it needed to do those things, and so it had resorted to the policy of impressment to staff the Royal Navy. Now, impressment was practiced at home as well as elsewhere. This is basically the process of kidnapping men against their will and forcing them into the service of His Royal Majesty on His Royal Majesty's ships. And discipline in the Royal Navy was remarkably harsh. Life was very hard, often tedious, and boring, and then deadly and dangerous in combat. Of course, men died of disease more than they died of battlefield action. But in order to maintain its big navy and its worldwide commitments in the blockade of Europe, the British had no choice as they saw it. And over the span of the Napoleonic Wars, they would impress more than 300,000 men. 300,000 men. And that included not just dragging people out of the bars and taverns and the streets of England, but stopping neutral ships on the high seas, boarding them, looking for people who were believed to be British citizens, and when they found them, kidnapping them, dragooning them, and taking them off that neutral ship and putting them onto a British warship and forcing them into British military service. Some 9,000 American sailors were impressed by the Royal Navy during this period. And this was, of course, all done by the British in a very arrogant fashion. The birth certificates didn't exist, and the British would board a ship. They would force the crew to assemble. They would ask last names, and if they saw someone they thought looked British or whose name sounded British, they would say, well, you're a British citizen, and now we're going to draft you into the Royal Navy. And when the Americans said, well, you think we could board a British ship and look at somebody and just say, well, you look like an American, we'll take you, the British said, well, that's preposterous. There's no way anybody could do that. But of course, as Englishmen, we're capable of doing that. So impressment was a great affront to American sovereignty and American honor. and American commerce. The blockade was as well. The British were also hovering off our coast to try and stop our ships from putting out to sea, and they were doing all sorts of nasty things along the coast, forcing coastal towns to provide fresh water and provisions, and occasionally staging raids on American territory if they felt like the Americans were not behaving the way that the British wanted. It's not that France was being any kinder to us. The French response to the Orders of Council was to inaugurate what they called the Continental System, which basically forbid all British ships from coming into the continent of Europe. And so if you boil this down, if the Americans tried to trade with France, the English Navy is going to attack us. And if we try and trade with Britain, the French Navy or French privateers are going to attack us. This is an intolerable situation. Jefferson, as was his wont, tried to deal with it through diplomacy, and it didn't work because neither England nor France cared about the philosophy, the feelings, or the rights of the pipsqueak United States, wherein there's great war against their greatest of all enemies. And it led Jefferson in frustration to proclaim that as for the French and the English, the one is a den of robbers and the other of pirates, which is pretty strong language coming from Thomas Jefferson. But it was a situation that was packing a powder keg, and sooner or later that powder keg was bound to explode, and it seemed like the moment had come. On June 21st of 1807, when there occurred an infamous event known as the Chesapeake Affair. The Chesapeake Affair. Now, the Chesapeake Affair is named after a United States Navy frigate, the USS Chesapeake, which left Norfolk in Virginia on a cruise into the Atlantic Ocean on June 21st of 1807, and the captain of the Chesapeake left port early because he found favorable winds, even though his ship was not really ready to go to sea. All the cargo and supplies hadn't been packed away, and so the lower decks were strewn with boxes and crates, so you couldn't even get to any of the guns on the ship. And he did that despite the fact that the tensions between the U.S. and Britain were running high, and a British squadron was off of Chesapeake Bay. And from this British squadron, there had been a number of desertions of British sailors, some of whom had gone ashore, assumed different names, and then joined the American Navy. And there was one particularly notorious deserter that the commander of the British squadron wanted to get, and he heard that he was on the Chesapeake. So when the Chesapeake set sail, a British warship, the HMS Leopard, followed it. And somewhere out in the open waters of the Atlantic, a relatively handful of hours after the Chesapeake had left American waters, the Leopard came alongside the Chesapeake and ordered it to heave to and prepare to be boarded. They were going to step on the deck of the American ship and look for deserters from the British Navy. And the American commander said, well, what are their names? And the British gave them their names. And of course, no one with those names had actually enlisted. Now, in fact, there are some deserters from the British Navy there under assumed names. The American captain doesn't know that. And beyond that, he cannot allow this to happen. The reality legally is that a nation's warships, just like its embassies and consulates, enjoy the right of extraterritoriality. That means if you're standing on the deck of an American warship anywhere in the world, you are standing on American soil as if you're right here in Austin, Texas. And we would not let a foreign military power come into our classroom and kidnap someone into another country's military service. And so the captain of the Chesapeake wasn't going to let that happen. He refused. At which point, and without warning, the Leopard opened fire. And it pumped a couple of broadsides into the Chesapeake, which of course was incapable of resistance because all of the supplies and gear hadn't been stowed, the ammunition was locked up, the crew couldn't even get to the guns. They managed to fire a single shot for the honor of the flag before they hauled down the colors. The British boarded the Chesapeake, assembled its crew, found 4 men they claimed were deserters, 2 of whom actually were, took them back to the Leopard. The most notorious of those deserters that they had wanted, they caught and they hung, and then they sailed away. And when word of the Chesapeake Affair, of course, got back to the United States, the American people were furious. This was a deliberate provocation. This was an act of war. A British ship had fired on an American warship without warning. Americans had been killed or wounded. 3 Americans were dead, 18 others wounded, and the public demanded war. But Jefferson refused to give it to them. He believed war was unnecessary, and he recognized the U.S. wasn't necessarily prepared for war. So instead of armed conflict, he decides to rely on what he calls peaceful coercion. Peaceful coercion, by implementing what today we would call economic sanctions against England. Economic sanctions against England. And he got Congress to pass on December 22nd of 1807 something called the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act shut down all American commerce with England and France, because remember the French weren't treating us well either, shut down all American commerce with England and France, their colonies and territories they controlled, which means we're shutting off commerce with most of the rest of the world. And initially, the Embargo Act was very popular. We're going to show the British and the French they can't deal without American agricultural products. We're going to bring them economically to their knees. This is all reminiscent, isn't it, of the Continental Association that was founded in response to the British coercive acts and were supposed to bring England to its knees by economic sanctions. And it hadn't worked then, and it doesn't work now. England has an empire to draw resources from, and although the American embargo hurts, she's not about to back down and agree that it's going to stop impressment, it's going to end its blockades, all the demands the Americans are making. And the French have the resources of an entire continent to draw on, so they're not going to back off either. And so the economic devastation that the Embargo Act was supposed to render doesn't happen to England or France. It happens to the United States, because without overseas commerce, Americans begin to go bankrupt. Stores close, banks collapse, farms and plantations fail. Plantation owners, even Jefferson himself, go deeply into debt. Ships rot at their berths while the piers grow grass. Sailors and longshoresmen and people who depend on the seafaring trades are all out of work and having a hard time making a living. And as the economic devastation spread across the U.S., people turned against the Embargo Act, and they wanted Jefferson to lift it. And Jefferson refused. He said we had to stay the course. But the longer he stayed the course, the more pain there was, and the more Americans became unhappy. And Jefferson simply doubled down. So when some Americans tried to trade with England overland through Canada, he sent troops up there to stop the trade. When some Americans tried to follow the traditional path of smuggling, he sent what there was of the U.S. Navy to, in essence, blockade our own ports to keep the smugglers from going to sea. When New York threatened to nullify the Embargo Act. And who's the person who put nullification into our political vocabulary? Jefferson, right? In the Kentucky Resolution, Jefferson sent the army into New York to cow it and to prevent it from taking this step. And of course, the worst thing about all of it was that the policy failed, and it failed badly. It did not get the results that Jefferson had wanted, and that made Jefferson not only unpopular, it made him look ineffective. And so by the time that the election of 1808 is rolling around, Jefferson is politically a cooked goose, and the country is anxious to be rid of him. Now, that's not trouble for the Democratic-Republican Party because it's still the dominant party. It controls basically the South and the new states that are cropping up in the West. That gives the Democratic-Republicans more than enough to control the Electoral College and the Congress and therefore the presidency. And so Jefferson is not going to run for a third term. He could have. Remember, theoretically, that's possible, although since Washington had set the precedent of 2 and done, it would be pretty gutsy for somebody to say they ought to be president longer than George Washington. But Jefferson is going to step off to the stage. The man who's going to become the nominee of his party is his Secretary of State, James Madison, the author of the Constitution. And remember that Jefferson had been a Secretary of State and then goes on to be president, and now that's going to happen again. James Madison, as Secretary of State, is going to be easily elected by the Democratic-Republican Party to the presidency in 1808, and Madison is therefore going to inherit this mess on the Atlantic Ocean. He's going to inherit this mess of economic trouble with England and France, but he's not going to inherit the Embargo Act. which the newly elected Congress repealed, and Jefferson signed that repeal into law just 3 days before Madison took the oath of office. So Madison comes in. He's not going to have to deal with the Embargo Act, but he's going to have to deal with England and France, their war, and how that war is affecting the United States. And as it turns out, he's going to have to deal with some serious problems on our Indian frontier in Indiana as well. And between all of those circumstances, Mr. Madison, against his hopes and wishes, is going to find himself the leader of the United States plunged once again into war, only this time into a declared war against one of the mightiest powers on the European continent, and that is Great Britain. Madison is going to be a wartime president as the United States fights what many people will come to see as a second American Revolution. And so that ends part 3 of lecture number 2. And so time for everybody's favorite part, time for the questions that you need to answer and email in to me. So here are the questions for this part of the quiz. True or false? The United States purchased Louisiana Territory from Spain during the administration of Thomas Jefferson. The United States purchased Louisiana Territory from Spain under the administration of Thomas Jefferson. True or false? Impressment was the primary way for the British to man their ships during the the Napoleonic Wars. And impressment means kidnapping foreign nationals as well as their own nationals into the service of the Royal Navy. So impressment, true or false, was an important way for the British to maintain the strength of their Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, and it was a method by which they kidnapped both their own and foreign citizens and forced them against their will into the service of the Royal Navy. True or false? The United States fought a war in North Africa under the Jefferson administration against the Tripoli pirates, or sometimes known as the Barbary pirates. True or false? The United States fought a successful war against countries in North Africa, the Tripoli countries, the Barbary pirates, under the administration of Thomas Jefferson. True or false? It was Jefferson who signed the law creating the United States Military Academy at West Point. And lastly, true or false, in the Chesapeake affair, the American warship USS Chesapeake opened fire without warning on a British warship, the HMS Leopard. True or false, in the Chesapeake affair, an American warship, the USS Chesapeake, opens fire on a British warship, the HMS Leopard. So answer those questions, email them to me within the week. This is the end of lecture number 2, part 3. There is one final part, lecture number 2, part 4, that will deal with the Madison administration and the War of 1812. And that final lecture part will be our last piece to deal with before we take our second test.